It's really lovely to be here. Just a little bit about myself. I've had about 30 odd years mainly in human resources and learning and development. I've worked across lots of different industries, retail, hospitality, healthcare, lots of different experiences. And like a lot of people pre-COVID, and certainly my kids are in their 20s now, but I had some really rough experiences of working and trying to do the whole juggling challenge, which so many of us have. And that's really what's led me to coming into working for the organisation I work for now. And I work for an organisation called Flexibility Works. We're a social enterprise and charity based in Scotland, working to support businesses across Scotland to help them make great workplaces for people and to enable people to that whole, we talk about work-life balance, but is it really ever truly work-life balance? But we want to support businesses to show them that there is a good business reason why flexibility works for all. So that's the organisation I work for, and hopefully in the next 15 minutes I can show you that there is a really strong case for flexibility, not just in what we tend to think of as roles that can be done flexibly, but across lots of different roles in lots of different sectors, across lots of different businesses. So I want to start with something that's probably a little bit seasonal, and this might resonate more with people of probably my age group. But anyone care to remind me, who is that and what film was that from? Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist with his bowl going, and what was he doing with his bowl? Can I have some more? Okay. So I wanted to start with that, and you're probably thinking, why have I got a picture of Oliver Twist, apart from the fact it's a film that often comes out at Christmas? Because you shouldn't be begging for flex. It shouldn't be something you have to go with your begging bowl to get, okay? We always say flex is not a favour, okay? It is not a favour. It is something that benefits the well-being of workers and will make them happier, more loyal, and more productive. And for businesses, the business arguments are incredibly strong. And I hope that in the time I've got with you this morning, this evening, I can show you that there is a really strong argument for flex. And hopefully, I'd like you to feel that you can come away from this feeling empowered about getting that right balance in your life. So remember, flex is not a favour. So I'd like to start, if you wouldn't mind getting your phones out. I usually ask people to put their phones away, but if you wouldn't mind just scanning that QR code, and I'd just like to get a little bit of a sense of people's experiences. And there should be a question coming up, and the question is, what has or what maybe in the past put you off requesting flexibility in a role? And you've got a number of options there, but choose. They might all apply, or it might be only one applies or a couple apply. But if you could just pick the options that have applied, that's very interesting. Right. There's Wi-Fi on our laptop, but if there is, thank you. Bit of a Wi-Fi. Thank you very much, Magdalena. So that's interesting. We've got some really interesting. Number one, an obvious lack of support for flex from senior leaders in my workplace. And obviously, there's something there about being worried about it impacting on career development. None of this would surprise me at all. Those are responses we see all the time from people who've had bad experiences. I had bad experiences myself. When my children were young, I could have really benefited from some flexibility, and it didn't seem to exist. And I didn't know my rights, so I didn't know what to ask for or how to go about doing that. But thank you for that's really interesting, just to get a bit of a pulse check in the room. And I hope for those of you who've not made it onto the Wi-Fi, you can still, I'll be able to see the full results at the end, and I can share those with Magdalena. So you probably have seen lots and lots of headlines in the news about flexible working. Often you hear about hybrid and remote working. That seems to be the kind of key form of flexible working that you tend to hear about, probably because people like Jacob Rees-Mogg have made a big play about people sitting at home in their pajamas and being really lazy. And the press inevitably pick up on those stories. And there have been quite a few negative stories. There have been stories from big organisations like Amazon who have been pulling back on what previously they were offering in terms of flexibility. But there's also some real positive stories out there. And interestingly, even countries like Japan, who have traditionally had an appalling work culture with really high levels of kind of ill health and heart conditions from people who've just been working absolutely ridiculous hours, are now really going down the line of looking at a 4-day week. So it's really interesting that a country that previously had a very negative work-life balance culture has really moved on. But we do tend to hear about just hybrid working, and it's not just about hybrid working, but that seems to be the thing that the press often jump on. There are so many different forms of flexibility. I used to work for a nursing organisation, and there's some really innovative examples of flexibility within healthcare now, which is not a sector you would traditionally associate with flexible working. But for those type of sectors, flexibility does look different. It could just be having a bit more choice and control over shifts. It might be being able to swap shifts with your colleagues. For many people, it is working at home and working hybrid. But for other people, it might just be able to start work 15 minutes later in the morning to be able to drop your children at school or at nursery, and perhaps taking a shorter lunch break and being able to leave earlier in the evening. So flexibility takes so many shapes and sizes, comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And increasingly, we're seeing some really innovative companies, even who are working in manufacturing, engineering, who are looking at how they can bring in flexibility. One reason why some businesses often say they can't bring in flexibility is, well, I only have a certain amount of people who work in the office and everybody else is frontline. So if I can't give hybrid to everybody, I'll give it to nobody. And then everybody suffers. But actually, the companies that are being more forward-thinking are realizing that the same type of flexibility will not suit all roles, and it won't suit all teams, but there are ways that you can introduce flexibility in different teams in different ways. We do quite a bit of research, and this comes from our own data, but it is very much a consistent picture with data coming from other sources. Flexible working is now probably the number one factor that people are using as a reason for making a selection in a new job search. Pay is obviously important. You've got to pay the bills. But ultimately, people have experienced a different way of working now, and they don't want to go back. And I always talk about the genie being out of the bottle. People proved that people could work in different ways during COVID, and people in many walks of life are not prepared to go back to a traditional kind of 9 to 5, being in person all the time. But we do know that that job search criteria is particularly important for women and particularly important for parents. We also know that the people who don't work flex, unfortunately, there is a bit of a salary divide, and there's strong evidence that the more you earn, the more likely you have more flexibility, which obviously affects people who are at the kind of beginning parts of their career. So it does affect people, particularly women in low-earning households, people earning under 20,000, frontline workers, which includes obviously things like education as well as healthcare and factory workers, but particularly women, and also people who've got a disability or a long-term health condition. But the good news is there's really strong evidence that there are many business benefits of having flexibility in the workplace. And 71% of the employers that we surveyed said that flex has had a positive impact on their organisation. They've looked at their metrics and they've recognised that it's brought many business benefits. And we found that that tends to be in these 9 areas, with productivity being better, health and well-being being improved for employees, sickness absence being lower, generally, where you've got a more flexible workforce, and then recruitment being better candidates, and able to keep people longer. So retention, which obviously is a huge expense for an organisation if you're having to constantly recruit. Obviously very topical for tonight is in terms of inclusion and diversity being positively impacted by more flexible workplaces. Brand reputation. People are now looking for those flexible workplaces. So if an organisation wants to be at the front of somebody's shopping list when they're looking at organisations to work for, one way of doing that is showing that you're a flexible workplace. Also in terms of financial improvements and the environment. A couple of the key ones are 64% of employers saying that flex has enabled them to increase overall business productivity. The retention figure is really powerful. 75% of employers said that flex has helped them to retain good staff. But probably one of the main things is the fact that the impact on staff is significant, and we know that workers with flex tend to feel more calm and focused at work, which obviously is going to impact on all those other areas in terms of sickness absence, in terms of productivity, etc. So the business benefits are really strong and evidenced. So what happens in terms of what are your rights? There has been a lot of talk recently about the new Employment Rights Bill that has been laid down by the new Labour government, because when it comes to employment law is a UK matter. It is not reserved to the Scottish Parliament. So whatever changes are brought in will affect the whole of the UK, including Scotland. So there's been a new Employment Rights Bill, but it is going to take a few years to work its way through the parliamentary process. So what I'm going to share with you is really what the law says now, as opposed to what it's going to be potentially in 2 years. Firstly, you have got every employee, and that's somebody who's employed as opposed to a contract worker, has a right to make a flexible working request on day 1 of their employment. Previously, a couple of years ago, because this law only came in April of this year, previously you had to wait 6 months before you could make a flexible working request. You can now make it on day 1. But the reality is, how many of us, if we're looking for a job, are going to wait till day 1 to have that conversation? You're going to want to know before. But it is still a positive change, and you can now make that request on day 1. A lot of employers will be expecting to have that conversation even before perhaps the application stage, when the advert's already out. And the savvy employers are going to mention it in their adverts. They have to be dealt with. If you put in a formal flexible working request, it has to be dealt with by the employer within a 2-month period. It used to be 4. 2 months does still seem like a long time, but I think we all recognise sometimes these things can work quite slowly in terms of bureaucratic processes. What has been a really positive change this year is the employer does have to consult with you. So if you put a flexible working request in, your employer, if they are not happy to support that request, can't just say no and write you an email to say no. They have to meet with you, and they have to have a meeting with you. So the focus is very much on there being consultation and there being discussion. It might be that you can't have everything that's been requested, but it might be that there is a compromise that could be reached, which works for you and for the employer. You can make 2 flexible working requests in a 12-month period as well, and previously you could only make 1. And that's really important, because our lives are not sort of straight line, are they? Things change, circumstances change. It could be something to do with your family. It could be your own health. There could be a number of things that change. So now you can make 2 flexible working requests. The employer can refuse. So remember, this is a right to request, not a right to have that request accepted. But they can only refuse based on 8 statutory reasons, which includes things like the burden of additional cost, if it would affect productivity or if it would affect performance. But the employer does need to think really carefully about that being a genuine reason and not just something that they perceive may happen. And interestingly, with the new legislation that's coming in, the most significant change that's coming about with that is that although the reasons for refusing will be the same, the employer will have to be much more careful about evidencing that there is a genuine reason. And if that was challenged at a tribunal and that those reasons were interrogated, they would have to stand up to scrutiny. At the moment, if you take an employer to a tribunal, it's generally because the process has been incorrect. And you do have protection under the law if you make a flexible working request or if you submit a tribunal request, if you were effectively disputing what the employer had done with your flexible working request. And so what that means basically is you can't be penalised if you make a flexible working request. And that's really interesting, going back to what you shared at the beginning about people feeling uncomfortable within the culture of their organisation to make a flexible working request because they don't think it's going to be supported. So the law is there. So many employers, the good news is, are going way beyond that. They want to have conversations. They want to get the best people. They want to have a diverse workforce, and they know that the only way they do it, and with all the progress that we've made with caring and there being a shift in terms of caring across different genders, the fact is that women still have the burden for caring, particularly for children, but often they have the double whammy of caring for children and caring for older relatives at the same time. And the reality is, it is something, and looking at the figures that you showed at the beginning, that there is a reason why people are perhaps not progressing through the levels in your organisation, because something's stopping people progressing with their career. What is that? It may be a number of things, but we know from the evidence that the impact has and continues to impact on women the most when it comes to flexible working, and the need being greater amongst women and people who are caring for and parents. So often it's a question we get asked. So if I'm applying for a job and I don't see flexibility mentioned in the advert, and that's quite common because probably only about 30% of jobs mention flexibility. That might be because the organisation is not either upskilled in terms of what their responsibilities are, but perhaps is not positive about flexibility. But it might also be because they just haven't put it in the advert. So I would always say to people, just because you don't see anything in the advert, that doesn't mean that organisation is not open and welcoming of flexibility. You might just have to look for other clues. So I would always say, if you're applying for a job and you're thinking about that you will need some form of flexibility in that, is really think about the role and really think about what is realistic. What is going to be realistic for that role, and think about the actual mechanics of how you could carry out that role and get the flexibility that you need. Is what you're asking for realistic, and can you evidence in a way that you can make it work? So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is do a bit of snooping around on the organisation, which I'm sure you do anyway when you're applying for a new role. But there may well be clues as to the fact that they are a flex-friendly organisation. If they have family-friendly awards, if they are, for example, a real living wage employer. If you see some of these badges on an employer's website, those are generally good signs that they care about the well-being of their staff, and they're more likely to be a flex-friendly organisation. And also, social media profiles can be give you really good clues as to the type of people that they're employing, and perhaps people sharing their stories about how they're working part-time or flexibly. And lastly, when you have the conversation with your prospective employer, don't just ask, do you offer flexible working? Because for a lot of employers, well, what do you mean by that? You're asking the employer to do the thinking rather than presenting them with a potential solution. So be really targeted in what you're asking for, and be very specific about what it is that you need. You're more likely to get a better response if you can do all three of those things. And lastly, what I would say is, irrespective of where you are in your career, it's so important to have flex role models in the workplace. And you might not be in a leadership position now, but you might be in a leadership position in the future. And if you are in a leadership position, role model flexible working. It makes a massive difference to people to feel comfortable about engaging in those conversations about flexibility if they can see people leaving on time, obviously going to pick up their children or go to their school nativity play, which is hopefully what's happening at the moment if people have got young children. If people see that happening, it's so much easier to be able to ask for flexibility if you see it. If we go back to the survey that we had at the beginning, one of the things was around people just not seeing people working flexibly. If you don't see it, it's hard to believe that you're going to get a positive response if you ask for flexibility. So I would say, if you're in that position to be able to do that now, do it now. And if it is something that you aspire to in the future, do it in the future. It will make a huge difference to the next generation of people coming through into the workplace. That's all I have to say. Just lastly, Magdalena did say, please put a QR code up at the end. So there's a QR code there which links to our website. We've got a lot of resources there, free resources, free guides and what have you, which you obviously are welcome to benefit from. We've got some videos and all sorts of helpful resources.
My name's Gina Colley. I'm an architect and associate director at 360 Architecture. I've been with the practice for over 10 years now, so kind of seen it grow quite a lot over the years, and recently we've been doing quite a lot of interesting and I think really good work in the equality, diversity and inclusion world. I'm basically going to show you a little bit of our journey over the last few years and what we've been up to. Aside from obviously these internal changes and improvements, we are a practice that's based here in Glasgow. Just our headquarter building is kind of down the hill at the garment factory on Montrose Street. We've got about 30 staff there, and we've got around 5 in Inverness city centre as well. We cover all sectors, work for public and private clients, and recently we've been more and more in the kind of urban master planning and town centre vision type of work. This is us. You might see some familiar faces sitting down the front here. And recently at the Scottish Design Awards, we were really proud to be named Architectural Practice of the Year 2024-2025. You got it? Yeah, cool. And this is our Inverness studio, which is a ground floor high street studio on Academy Street, which is one of the high streets in Inverness. So trying to practice what we preach in terms of retail repurposing and diversifying the uses within town centres and city centres. We've taken a couple of vacant retail units on the street, smushed them together and created a little office up in the Highlands. And you can see down the bottom there, hands up if you know what a B Corp is. Few people, cool, yeah. Hopefully you guys do. Yeah, so I guess it's a global movement of businesses who change their articles of association to not only be to make profit, but to be responsible to all stakeholders, including their staff, the community, the planet, etc. And it's something that took us about 18 months to achieve, which I'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along. But we were the first to get that accreditation as in an architectural practice headquartered in Scotland. And so far I think we're still the only one in that category as well, but I'm sure there'll be people hot on our heels coming up, which is great. Next slide. This is our why statement, as we call it, and we are always a practice that is very vision and values led. So we spent quite a bit of time to come up with a statement that explains our purpose and our vision of why we exist, and we're committed to making places better, so not only through our projects but internally as well. You might not be able to see some of the writing on this slide, it's a little bit small, but this is basically a summary of our journey. We moved to the garment factory in 2018, and during COVID actually we started the journey on our B Corp journey. So that was kind of 2020. There was a bit of spare time for low and things. There was something we saw and we thought that really aligns with our values. We should put the effort and the time into seeing what this is all about. And once we kind of went through that whole process, we got qualified and certified in 2022. And then we went through a bit of a process of kind of re-establishing our vision as a practice. And that included a lot of the EDI work that I'll talk you through. We became a member of Inclusive Employers, who have been really helpful on this journey, supporting us through our EDI process. And last year as well, we established an internal EDI kind of working group. Mentioned the Scottish Design Awards, but most recently we won our first award for diversity and inclusion from Built Environment Smarter Transformation this year, so that was great as well. Cool. So B Corp is basically founded on 5 pillars: governance, workers, customers, community, and environment. And basically every year you have to prove that you're kind of improving year on year on all of these kind of 5 topics. So these along the side here are examples of our annual impact reports on how we're showing that improvement. So the start of the journey, I suppose, for me was actually working with Built Environment Smarter Transformation. A great organisation. I'm sure most of you will be aware of them. This is some research by my colleague Emily Carr, who has taken some of the things that we started within the Built Environment Changemakers and took it forward into Sweden and created an amazing piece of research. QR code here if you want to read it. Sorry, 2 seconds. I catch my breath. Yeah, she basically took forward a set of practices that we developed and went around different industries and businesses in Sweden and learned what they were doing well in the EDI world, and it's a really great read. But it basically gave us the building blocks to start our journey with EDI. So these are some of the tools that we developed within the Built Environment Changemakers. Basically, it's a workshop that any business can do. It starts off with what does EDI mean to you? It looks at identifying what's holding you back, what's pushing you forward. It looks at what can you do to build your actions, grow your actions even bigger than what they already are. And it looks at highlighting role models within the business. So if anybody's interested in a little bit more about how this workshop works, I can talk to you about it afterwards. But we basically did that within 360 and it started off our journey. as I said, we became a member of Inclusive Employers, and they really supported us in kind of amplifying that journey. So I'd really recommend them as an organisation as well. But basically, what we decided to do first was create a group within the practice, which, you know, it was an EDI group that reflected all levels from junior staff all the way up to director level staff. And we put a poll out. We said, who here is interested in kind of becoming part of this group? And I was really happy to see 12 people kind of responded positively. So now I think we're nine people, yeah. And we basically set about starting to define our priorities and what we're going to be focusing on next year. So you can see some of the initiatives here that people have sort of paired up in the group, and we're prioritised this year looking at paternity leave, flexible work. So Alison, I was so interested in hearing you speak, and I'm sure we're going to be taking a lot of what your advice on this one, and neurodiversity in the workplace. And basically, we're just at the stage of defining why it's important to look at these three things and creating alignment with management and with people all throughout the business. So next slide. So you can see here how our EDI group sits within the business structure. It's really important for me to have it be quite a formal entity that, you know, it has reporting structures and it has clear hierarchy and how the decisions are made within the business. So basically, the EDI group works hand in hand with the B Corp committee, but also reports to our vision board and our operations board, with direct people that link between those groups, and then ultimately to the board of directors, where we try and convince the decisions to be made. So yeah, important to sort of formalise it and give it structure. Next slide. Something else we've been doing for the past 5 years now is partnering up with other organisations and charities that we really admire, and are doing, you know, bigger work than we could ever achieve as a sort of small medium practice. But the EY Foundation have supported over 24,000 young people from low income backgrounds or who are CIAT experienced, with work experience and training for career development and things like that. So yeah, we've been providing placements with them since 2019, and we're really happy to be recognised by them this year as well with a Scotland Employer Partner Impact Award for the work with them. So that's one thing we've been doing. We're trying to create a lot more connections with academia, so it's great to be here today and making better connections with the colleges. We are quite connected with Strathclyde, obviously by our proximity, but one thing we've been doing is, or we've been finding out from students, some feedback is that international students can't work during the term time. Their visas don't let them, so we basically created some summer positions specifically for international students so that they could come for a set amount of time, and usually it was in the workshop, creating some fantastic models in the studio, and it was just something we trialled this year, but we think that you know, it was received well, and we'll hopefully try and improve on that in the next year. And then I suppose another thing that we do is we're really quite open with our studios, both in Glasgow and Inverness, and we try and put on events that open up to the wider community, not just the architectural community, but the wider kind of creative community in Scotland, and put on events that are not necessarily specifically about architecture, but about issues that we care about. So the musicians there are two Scottish musicians who champion classical music by kind of underrepresented female composers. So they had an album launch at 360. We had a series of lectures during COVID, including about why Black Lives Matter. We've worked with open plan for Pride events and things like that. So just kind of project into the outside world about your values and what you care about has been really good for us in the last couple of years. You might see another familiar face there, Marina, in the middle there. That's how I met Marina at a recent event with Revo, which I kind of coordinated with May East, who is a fantastic author and researcher who talks about the same sort of things, gender-sensitive urban planning, and Susanna Walker from Make Space for Girls as well. And I'm sure you'll hear a lot of interesting stuff from Marina in the next section. But basically, that webinar was really, really well attended, and I think it goes to show that this conversation is something people are becoming more and more interested in and knowledgeable about, and I think it's going to be a really hot topic next year. And lastly, I was going to talk about maternity leave. And paternity leave, it seems like it's the kind of fundamental thing that we need to get right, I suppose. Did quite a bit of research about, the context of the EU, the context of the UK, the context of the architectural community. A quick show of hands, who thinks the UK and Ireland have some of the worst maternity pay in the whole EU? You'd be right. So we're really lagging behind some of our peers, and until that catches up, I think it's one of those systemic issues that's holding women back in all industries, but in the architectural world for sure. There's a very clear drop off after people reach sort of like child rearing age, and a drop off in obviously seniority and management level roles for women in the industry. So we thought, well, let's just try and flip that a little bit and try and have a package that is probably, I'd say, one of the best in the industry. I haven't seen a betterment within the architectural community in Scotland, which is 6 months full pay. And the first colleague is currently on maternity leave for that at the moment, which is amazing to see. But yeah, and then obviously it raised the question, what about paternity leave? Because we know that it's not just about supporting mothers through the transition, but we're never going to be fully equal if fathers don't play a more present and active role in caring as well. So one of my colleagues who's also on the EDI group is trying to promote this campaign by Pregnant and Screwed. Let's talk about 6, which is for 6 weeks full paid paternity leave as well. So fingers crossed that's coming next year. Next slide. Final slide. Just a quick one, because I haven't talked about design at all, but we do a lot of work within town and city centres, so some local projects here on the screen, and I feel like we've been pushing the bar higher and higher in terms of how we are reaching more and more people in the community, not just in numbers, but trying to find like those hard to reach groups, like young women, young people in general, I suppose. So yeah, in East Kilbride, it was way more than the statutory 2 days consultation. It was 3 weeks. It was multimedia. It reached over 3,000 people, which was really, really great. In Glasgow, Golden Z, we put on specific focus groups for kind of young women, and just tried to like reach the community as many different hard to reach groups as you possibly can. Traditionally cities have not been designed around women's needs, which I'm sure Marina will talk a lot about in the next section, but hearing what are women's daily travel plans and daily commuting patterns that really inform how we design city centres and town centres. So yeah, that's another big focus for us in the year to come. I think I'm wrapping up. Oh yeah, a couple of just round up stats about 360 basically. we're not quite gender balanced, but hopefully one day we will be. We're living wage. Well, we pay a living wage. We're currently being accredited for the living wage employment. I've mentioned quite a few of these stats over the course of the talk, but yeah, next slide. All that to say, we were really excited that it sort of came full circle back to the start, where it started with built environment smarter transformation, who kind of started off this whole journey and then have recently kind of recognised us with an award for diversity and inclusion. So that's me finished rambling, but thank you very much.
Thank you for the great introduction, and thank you so much for that great segue, because I was like trying to think on my feet, like how do I go now from this very important topic of how do we bring more women into the practice, because that data is devastating, into actually something that is going to be a slightly different, but I think still very important, which is those women who are in the practice, but not also women is not just a woman's issue, male allies. How do we, within our own profession, create places that work for women and girls and challenge gender biases? Because I will demonstrate gender biases are also embedded in the way we design cities and also the city services. Just a little bit of background, I kind of got this introduction, so I thought I'll just crack on. I am a landscape architect and urban planner, and up until 10 days ago, I was working for the Mayoral Development Organization, delivering the Olympic legacy. That project ended, and now I kind of in between of doing all of my work, I got my passion for gender equality in urban design and planning, and I've established a little consultancy, kind of bringing this knowledge now to, because it can be done and it's quite simple. So my mission is now to really help local authorities, developers, practices to kind of understand the value of actually designing places that are gender equitable. And yeah, I'll be talking about something that couple of us who were working, including May East, which is absolutely brilliant. She is here in Scotland, so yeah, it's fantastic that you have it. Coined as a gender-informed urban design and planning, or gender-sensitive. It's used interchangeably. And it's beautiful to speak here because Glasgow is the first feminist city, and I met actually with the lead person today because we've been talking for quite a long time, sharing experience, and I think what is coming is really exciting. So well done to you all, and that's amazing that you're going to have it. Is it this one? It's fine. Oh, okay. Yes. Why are we talking about this? And I think this is I think it's quite known, and I think it's quite an obvious issue, but I always kind of like starting, although I don't like talking about problems because I think it kills our creativity. We get too stuck in, whoa, why we're here, us versus them. I like us to kind of think forward, but I think it's really important to identify what is the issue in order to understand, how can we tackle the problem. And I think, the fact is that our cities have predominantly been designed by those in position of authority. And when I say authority, I mean money. And traditionally that has been able-bodied cisgender man. And it's kind of this approach to not considering needs of women and girls in the services and design of the cities have really embedded gender biases into pretty much everything around our city. And we have quite a lot of evidence to kind of prove that, not to prove, but to corroborate, to kind of just understand where the problems are. I think it was mentioned that land uses still really reflect that gendered roles, where man commutes from home to the office and women, I guess, stays at home, which obviously is not for a very long time been the case. Women as well take the share in, obviously, the workforce. But we are still prime caregivers, so our journeys are really way more diverse. It goes from, home to nursery, grocery, taking care of elderly, going to the office, coming back. But the land users still don't quite, I mean, we are starting to think about proximity in design, but I think we need to also like understand that this is as well a gender issue. And then one of the things that I think we've spoke quite a lot, and is probably the most tangible to understand, it is perception of safety. And I think we spoke a lot about that. Overwhelming majority of women feel unsafe. Sometimes it's a perceived perception, but that's a real thing. And women shrink their lives and they navigating the cities. And often they all together just avoid going out. And I think I had this like a very interesting conversation kind of like with male colleagues and thinking about like, when do you plan your journey back home? And for men it's usually, oh, when the party's over. And I go out and I'm like, okay, how do I go back home? And for women it's like, I don't leave the house unless I know how I'm going to go back home. Do I have money for taxi? So kind of like we do shrink our lives, and I think we are losing on the opportunity to just enjoy the civic life that, you know, should be kind of like a granted for everyone. And then something that is a little bit more subtle, but I think is quite important as well to think, is that women are not celebrated in public spaces. There are many studies, and one shows that only 2 to 3% of statues across the world represent women. And I think in the UK there is one of the surveys that shows there are more animals statues than named women. So I think it kind of like telling us that, is this really the place where we should be? But again, enough about problems. I think I spent too much time talking about that. Issue of gender is not just issue for women. I think it is something that we need to be thinking to advance the whole society. And it's not only that we should be designing the places because we are 51% of the population, so it's kind of like it just makes sense to design for, you know, majority of the population, but it truly, I think, kind of like can positively reflect and bring quite a lot of benefits on many other aspects of our society, including the economic growth. And, you know, we're talking about that, like access to work. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence and kind of like thinking about this, particularly economic, aspect, because I once had an argument with someone who was telling me like, oh, why in the industrial area we should, you know, care about this? This is already kind of like a messy environment. But then equally, I was working in London in one of the biggest industrial estates, and there was like this, you know, kind of like anecdotal evidence that the whole industry had to close because they were not able to recruit women. And we know how much our industry suffers from shortage of, you know, workers. So they were not able to recruit women who were working shifts because they just did not felt safe arriving to that place and leaving that place at a certain hours. But then also it makes me think about, climate change. Now, what that happens with that building, like, can you repurpose? That whole business had to move on, and so on and so on and so on. So it's kind of like I think, what I'm trying to say, it goes way beyond just inclusive design, and it tackles all of the aspects of the society. But how did I get to actually, talk about this topic and think about it? It was quite a rather simple question by one of our board members when I was working at LDC, asking, are we designing places that work for women and girls, that are safe or perceived safe for women and girls? And that landed with our director, who I commend a lot. I mean, he was really the champion of this. But our first kind of at the first instance, we just wanted to write a board report to say, oh yeah, the Queen Elizabeth and Olympic Park is safe because the statistics shows that it is. I somehow got involved, and I thought, like, well, this is kind of like not really fair because we don't have data. I don't know who said. I mean, women don't report, some of the harassment, and also is that a crime? So I said, like, well, can we just actually go and ask those people, women and girls, like how they feel, whether, you know, the places that we are designing cater for their needs. And that took me to what I not expect is going to be 3 years of researching, and I think more importantly, engaging with those very women and girls to actually understand from them, are we designing places that work for you? Like, there's no single one evidence where you can turn to answer that question. So we thought, well, let's create that evidence. And I mean, a lot of literature already exists. This is not a new topic. This is May's book. I recommend reading, but there is other really fantastic literature. And yeah, this is just kind of like we went, and I think what was also interesting is not that we were just like engaging and listening, but we were also testing and reiterating on live projects some of the solutions as we were going. So what did we learn in these 3 years? That first of all, is not just about safety, and I think women have the right to the city, and I think talking about the safety is setting the bar a little bit too low, because that kind of like embeds a little bit of gender biases, because it immediately, when you mention the safety, people think about policing, and they think about, putting all of the measures that actually don't really help. And yeah, we're just not victims. We have full the right to the city, and we have aspirations. So I think it really has to kind of like be looked beyond just safety. Designing places for women and girls do work for everyone, and I'm saying this because this is not about designing the places that just work for women and girls exclusively. This is just being sensitive to the differences in how, different genders perceive and navigate the places. Intersectionality is really important. Women and girls are not just like one homogeneous group. I think that is really, truly, truly important. Lived experiences are really diverse, and I will come to then the solution, which is we always should be looking for a very context-specific, community-specific solution. And I say this because my idea when I started doing this work was just to create a guidance, like a design guidance, to tell you, oh, paint the wall pink and put the light lux level X, and everything's going to be great. But gender inequality is extremely complex, and it's obviously deeply complicated issue, so it cannot be just resolved by simple kind of like a design guidelines. And yeah, goes about complexity of the topic. We need to be thinking about the city as a the place where people navigate. There's like, if we're working on a specific project, we need to be thinking about beyond that red line, no pun intended. And yeah, it's not that women and girls' voices are not captured because they don't want to engage with us, but there are so many barriers to engagement that we need to think about overcoming before we are then able to capture their voices into the process. So in summary, actually, I don't know if this sounds very complex, but actually the solution is very simple, and the solution is about listening to lived experiences of women and girls. And if you're doing engagement, and hopefully we are moving towards doing participatory, kind of like a genuine engagement, collect gender disaggregated data. Sometimes is as easy as that. Like, who said what? Do we know demographics? Because it really, really varies. And it's a lost opportunity. I mean, I was sitting at a meeting and they will say, oh, 100% of people really love this project. And you're like, who are these people? Because it can be just like once, same people. So yeah, the engagement is the key, as simple as that. But on top of that, it is also about adopting the planning processes, planning policies and development processes in order for that engagement to actually then be enforced and happen. And this is something I was talking with Glasgow today. It is about setting that commitment. So no matter whether you're a city or you're a small organization, for this really to work, you need to set that commitment that gender equality truly matters to you, and find that champion in your organization at the leadership level, because you need to have that support. Like, you need that buy-in. And then moving, kind of like down from there, then set the very clear, very simple, tangible actions, just saying this is really important to our organization, and these are the things that we can do to embed that. But then also you need to have people who hold you accountable, because one thing is to commit to something, another thing is how that gets delivered. And then going back to actual design and planning and development management, then we have created the processes that actually tell you step by step how do you do that. And when I say, again, in practice, this is what actually that means in reality. It is about walking the walks with women, understanding their lived experiences, and being really skilled to do that. And I've, tried this and error many times until I've learned that, from the sociologist how to listen to people, like just genuinely listen, like don't try to explain, don't try to, why the things are like that, just listen. And the other thing that I've learned from engaging with women and girls, the most important thing probably is pay participants. They are the experts and they are going to make your design so much better. So it's actually it's the smallest investment for the benefit that you're getting by not just women and girls, but generally, all of your community. But in this case, women and girls being kind of like caring for the community, you do get quite a lot from them, because first thing that they will tell you, they will talk about their community, about their family before they start talking to them. So you're really good and get good value there. And have that one gender champion in your organization who's really passionate about this. In the handbook that was mentioned, I wanted to make sure a gender champion doesn't have to have a degree in any gender studies. It's just a person who genuinely, cares about this and is going to move this forward. And I just wanted to, I guess, say here in terms of the policy that a lot of changes are happening, which is really exciting. I obviously mentioned probably this is the third time to say Glasgow is a feminist city. So that's really amazing. Use that to, kind of like I guess, as a leverage to the conversation with your, developers or whoever is that you're working for. And I think this is definitely, we're seeing it in London and we're seeing it in other organizations. Why planning policy is really important to be adopted? I think it is because it will force developers to set budget and time for engagement with women and girls, because I don't think this is an issue for architects, because I believe architects are really skilled and know how to engage, but most often you just don't have time. It's not a priority of your client. So that's why this is something to be solved kind of on the policy level. And then in terms of design, there are so many aspects to be considered. Nothing can be very prescriptive. It has to be context specific, but we have identified a couple of issues that should be looked with a little bit more care. Lighting, obviously, being one of the biggest one. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's Kevin Crawford. It's really from Marina. That was a very, very informative talk. Thank you very much. What you did is you touched and highlighted on one of the major problems which we have in this country, and that's the planning process. It's not just the planning process, it's the strength within the planning process to stick to policy. And that is where, shall we say, the whole system falls down. The vast majority of my work for my practice is I work for developers. We are right in at the coalface at early bid. And unfortunately, at early bid stage, it's all about the bottom line. If planning policy, specifically with MPF 4, starts to say, here is the plan and here's the zone for that, and here is what we as a local authority will accept and will not deviate from, then you will start seeing change. And unfortunately, if you're a landscape architect, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I would just say I'm also a policy planner, so I absolutely agree with that. And I agree. That's why the handbook that I worked on, I focused specifically on local authorities, but it's a little bit of chicken and egg because adopting local policy takes ages. So another thing is also proving return of investment for developers, and even more importantly to lenders, through ESGs, because it does de-risk their investment. So in a way, it is about like navigating what moves developer to move from that very bottom. But yeah, it's going to take a little longer, but we do hope that the policy will be a little bit more robust when it comes to these things.
Hiya. Thank you very much for today's event. It's extremely informative. I'm going to start with a statement which is really about when we speak about women's needs, and it's really about women's commitments and obligations, especially when they have, or parents' obligations, because sometimes need is not the right word. Sometimes commitment or obligation is what is there, and that's really important about the flexible working, but at the same time comes to planning. And it was lovely to see this photograph of the person trying to lift the child up the staircase, and has happened to me twice. No, it has happened to me twice. Actually, it has happened numerous times with 2 children. And there's nobody to help. And I think the point is common sense, or the lack of common sense many times, which is really policy not having common sense. How many of you have you tried to go with 2 children in a toilet in a shopping centre, and there's no space to leave the kids, except if you go to the disabled one? And it's really about how we start thinking about the resources, and how we start thinking about common sense planning and space planning, which then will become embedded in the way we think about planning. And if we don't think about people, and that includes men who go out in shopping centres with kids, not just women, how they're going to spend these 2 hours there, how they're going to be able to survive those 2 hours with the obligation they have, and the commitments they have, and the safeguarding they have, that will only make us all change the way that we design spaces. And something which is not about gender, but it's about people or kids kind of spaces. I ended up 6 hours at the A&E a couple of weeks ago, and the A&E for children hasn't got a kids' toilet. So, if we're designing A&E for children, and the A&E for children hasn't got a kids' toilet, and you're trying to juggle a kid over a disabled toilet, what are we going to do? So we need to start thinking at the very basic common sense. I'm sorry about making a statement rather than asking a question.
I'll ask the speakers to respond anyway. Thank you. Right, would anybody like to come in on that?
I know most of it wasn't about flexible working, but yeah, it's you talked about obligations, you talked about just making people's lives easier, is I think probably what I'm taking from what you said. And I suppose if I go back to my message and talking about just making people's lives easier, I remember when I had small children, all I needed to do, if I could have just left 10 minutes earlier, what a difference that would have made to be navigating a long journey home. And even that I didn't feel I could ask for, which is completely ridiculous, that I couldn't ask my boss, can I leave 10 minutes early and take 10 minutes off my lunch break? I wasn't exactly asking for a lot, but the culture, and I think it's the cultures that are often in place which are the barriers. And Marina's talked about the barriers within spaces and city centres and towns, but I think the cultures within organisations, and that's why it was really lovely to hear Marina's fantastic examples of what they're doing in their organisation. But actually, if we can just get the culture right, then that immediately removes perhaps a major barrier to people feeling that they can't have these conversations.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. I've got a list of questions because I came prepared. I wanted to ask you, all of you, and all of you in here as well, from experience, what are the biggest challenges for women in trying to communicate their needs?
I don't know, I think for me it's not about communicating needs, it's the fact that we are just put up and shut up and we just do. Women just do, and that's the difference. For me anyway.
I would just add from my experience that we're the same thing, I guess. We're conditioned not to think about our needs. And one of the things that I always say, like, what I'm hoping to achieve through this work is not so much to change drastically how we design. It's a little tweaks here and there. But it is about to make women think that if something doesn't work, it's not okay. Because that's the whole thing of like, oh no, I'm going to take a longer route. I don't even know why, but I've been doing this my whole life, my mother, and if there is a message how to, what's the problem is being told to women, it's like, oh, protect yourself, which we can't do anything about it. So yeah, it's a conditioning not to stand and say, hey, this doesn't work.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think when women stand up and try and advocate for change or suggest new ways of things that have always been the status quo, it's quite common to meet resistance, quite often from people who haven't had the same lived experience as us, and quite often it's like that there's not enough to go around. So if you're getting something, why can't I get something? It's like that kind of tit for tat thing, like, oh, you want more pay on maternity leave, well, can I have a sabbatical paid year sort of thing? And it's just really tricky when you come up against resistance from people who haven't had the same lived experience. And I don't really know what the answer is, but I suppose just like finding allies, and just kind of keeping on going, I suppose.
The only thing I'll add on is just picking up on your comment there, which was we tend to sort of put up and shut up and get on with it. And actually, I heard a fantastic advocate for flexibility who is a man who runs an IT recruitment agency, and he's just made it so much easier, because instead of people having to feel like they're going and asking, and that goes back to my Oliver Twist thing, he just asks always, what do you need? That is just a standard question he asks in the agent. So none of that fear factor, none of that I've got to build myself up to ask that question actually comes into play, because he just says, what do you need in order for you to come and do a really brilliant job for me? And so he hasn't actually advertised any jobs, because all of his recruitment now is done by word of mouth, because he has a great reputation being supporting everybody, men, women, people who've got health conditions. Just he wants the best people, and he knows if he asks that question, he's got a better chance of getting the best people.
And I suppose you were also talking about lived experience. Would you like to add any more on that? Why is it so important? How is that lived experience, or listening to that lived experience, change how we practice and how we design?
It's hard sometimes to explain something so simple, and something that again goes about to be common sense, because, well, I will just give one example, which is there was one brilliant study that really made me think, where they were assessing how safe is the park, and they asked users and they asked professionals, and users said totally opposite thing to professionals. I think our role, it is to create technical solutions to problem, not to assume what the problem is, because we are putting our own biases into that. And it's not even sometimes my own bias, it's the bias that I've learned from university. I never stopped to think who wrote these theories. I have no idea. I replicate them. Architecture is a very noble profession, so who am I to say, oh, this doesn't work? So you kind of, I think the issue is really embedded in so multiple, kind of like it's multifaceted. But one thing that you cannot deny, and is a really strong point, is when you have evidence. When you say, I'm doing this because these people told me. It's evidence that no one can, resist. So it really helps, and it's such a simple solution.
I would add on to that I think, yeah, we work in a noble profession, but we need to recognise where the regulations and the compliance and things have come from in the past. They've not always come from diverse groups of people that have developed these, so I think we have a responsibility as designers to really go above and beyond compliance-only solutions. Like, there's many examples. The recent kind of library in New York that's being kind of talked about just now because it's compliant in terms of disability accessibility, where half of the books are on a stepped slope that is inaccessible, but it was kind of deemed compliant. Or there's kind of the famous steps in Vancouver that are really, it's unsafe for wheelchair and people pushing prams. So I think, yeah, you can't just get away with saying, oh, we've designed a compliant basic solution. You have to listen to people, you have to go above and beyond, or nothing's ever going to change, I suppose.
Yeah, and just picking on that compliance thing, obviously I shared a bit about the law today, but that's the base, right? we're not talking good practice there, we're talking what you have to do. And I would also pick up, I was so pleased to hear what you were saying about engaging with staff, because that is the key message we always go out to employers, is just ask the staff. You know, there's lots of ways that you can do that so that people will be honest and feel psychologically safe to share what their lived experience is. And use the data and cut the data so that you can see who's giving you those answers. You know, is it the carers? Is it parents? But actually ask people, and actually what people ask for is not always massive. It's not always a big change. It can just be a small change. But please engage with your staff.
Thank you. One more.
So I just thought it's not finishing on a higher note to what I'm going to try and say. Things have changed over the last few decades quite dramatically, and one thing that just popped into my head there, when I started off in this industry, we were dealing with, as Gordon will know, the Orange Book from Strathclyde Regional Council of the Roads Development Guidelines. Now that sounds daft, but it's a very rigid set of rules which they stuck to. We have had since then coming on Designing for Streets and now the National Roads Guidelines. They are much, much better. They have taken many, many years, if not decades, to get through the system. But the changes are happening much, much more quickly than they've ever happened before. It is not that long ago, unfortunately, where I'm dealing with an application. We're trying to do something novel, something different, and they pull out the old damned Orange Book and say, that's the guidelines. So the problem is those peoples are dinosaurs. They are moving away. The newer generation, I'm an old dinosaur, I'm gone in the next 10 years. But the people that are coming in, they're the ones that are going to be making the decisions. So they're getting the benefit of the changes that have come up over the last 10, 20, 30 years, and it does move quicker. It won't happen overnight, but it is happening.
Thank you. Well, that was quite a positive ending, I would say. Right, I'm going to give you back 5 minutes to grab another drink, if you wish. Can we maybe just thank all the speakers again for their participation?